All right, welcome to Clarity. This is a podcast for reclaiming our focus, rediscovering a sense of purpose, and learning to navigate the confusions of life with resilience. And our guest today is Miss Jade Hayes, and she is a holistic health coach, mobility specialist, and she's operating out of Lafayette, Louisiana. She's shedding light on the mind-body connection and the body's incredible ability to heal. Jade, thank you for being here. How do you feel?
Yeah, I feel great. I'm happy to share the message that is really on my heart with the world. It's something I've wanted to do for a long time. So thanks for the opportunity.
You're welcome. We met maybe a couple of years back at this point at a transformational festival. And at that point, I was still in mental health counseling school, and I took one of your workshops. And what drew me in is that you had this very unique perspective on mobility. It wasn't quite a yoga class. It wasn't your average exercise class. And I don't quite know how to put words to it sometimes.
You're not alone there. And it's a hard class to sell because people are so drawn to things that they know. And we're kind of averse to things that are unknown and that take a lot of focus. And you go into this class and you feel very it's almost like a hit to the ego, because I am essentially finding the weakest points in the body and having you first bring awareness to those areas and then try to strengthen them. And so it can be a hard sell for people, but those who stick with it, they really reap the rewards, and that's really fun to see on my part.
Yeah, I think it was the first time I really slowed it down and focused on very specific muscles in the back. And you were doing yoga poses like cat-cow stuff, very common yoga poses, but really slowing them down and pointing out very specific muscles. So it was very refined.
That's a good word for it, refined. It's a very refined training.
Can you give a little bit about your background here? Because I know you started out in yoga training. You were trained with the Czech Institute, Paul Czech. So can you tell people maybe about your background a little bit more?
So, somebody asked me the other day when I was on a consultation call, like, do you have a medical background? And that answer used to it's like I kind of felt like, oh my God, I don't, what value do I have? I've really come to realize that it's actually a benefit, because there's a lot of indoctrination and a lot of old knowledge. In fact, I heard on a Huberman podcast, a neuroscientist had even said like 50% of what's in the medical journals are not accurate or outdated. I've really come to appreciate where I came from. I did start on the pre-med track. So I did 2 years of the pre-med route at LSU. And in that time, I ended up on antidepressants. And I was just miserable. I had great grades. It wasn't the schooling piece, but I think my soul was crying for a different path. And my husband, now best friend then, had told me that he was going to hike the Appalachian Trail. And I was like, what is that? Tell me more. So I watched a documentary with him. And at the end of that documentary, I looked at him and I'm like, can I come? He's like, absolutely not. You've got full paid scholarships, everything. What are you saying? You can't throw everything away. And I was like, yeah, I am. So it did. My family thought I was crazy. Friends thought I was crazy, but I felt this soul calling. And so I hiked a good bit of the Appalachian Trail. Then we hitchhiked East Coast to West Coast, and then I ended up pregnant. So came home. That was a bit of a hit. I was experiencing this freedom, but then I knew I really wanted to stay home and nurture my children. I had another one after that, but I knew I wanted to stay home with them for at least the first 5 years. And I really learned to love the yoga practice. And so I was like, well, I could go teach yoga and still be a stay-at-home mom. So I did that. And that's when the story gets interesting, because about a year into my teaching, I had practiced a lot. I was really good at the postures, and I had really mastered, I'd gotten comfortable in meditation. And then I herniated 2 discs. And I'm not going to say it's solely because of yoga, but that was a big catalyst. There's a lot of forward folding, a lot of improper cueing for the core, to no fault of the teachers. There's only so much that you can fit in a yoga training. But I herniated 2 discs, and all the PTs and chiros that I saw around here, which were a good bit of them, had told me that I would just have to deal with it. I'd have to live with the pain. Surgery was kind of mentioned, and that was a hard no for me. And so at 26 years old, I was refusing to, accept that fate, I guess you could say. And so I started deep diving into my own study, what functional anatomy was, like how do we actually use the body, not where is everything connected, but how does it all work. And in that I found eldoa, which was very interesting. It's a fascial stretching and strengthening technique. But I also found functional range conditioning. And when I was just watching YouTube videos and trying things out, and within about 3 months of really like deep diving in my own body and how to activate, learning different principles and concepts, I was completely pain free. 3 months is not a long time when you're dealing with disc pain. And I'm sure a lot of your viewers may have some of that experience. And so this was like light bulbs that went off for me. And that kind of like, threw me down the path of, oh, wait, I have to teach everyone I know this. And so I continued for a little while as a yoga teacher, but then definitely, because I couldn't practice yoga, knew I had to do without pain at that point, knew I had to do something else. So I got my personal training certification. And then I went to the mobility training course. And so once I became FRC certified, I started really focusing on mobility and helping people in the yoga world recover from pain and injury. And then a little while after that, I started realizing there was one client in particular. She kept coming back to me with hip flexor issues. I'm like, what is going on? We keep fixing this. And then I learned that, your organs are innervated by the same nerves that are, run to the muscles. And so I started diving deeper and deeper. And that's when I found the Tech Institute. And now I teach holistic health too. We had done everything healthy. When I learned I was pregnant, I changed my whole lifestyle. So I've been on this health journey for, I guess, my oldest one just turned 13 last Wednesday. So for about 13 years now. And now I can officially teach it, as a licensed practitioner. So that's really cool.
That's a very unique journey, Jade. There are some practices maybe you didn't agree with, and you took a hard right turn, went and took your own path. And it started out looking at your own injuries in your own body, which maybe in the medical system we gain a lot of cognitive knowledge, but we don't gain the physical experience of going through it. And it sounds like you actually gained the physical experience and knowing how your body operates on an experiential level.
Yeah, absolutely. When I teach from a place of experience. If I cue from the sensations I feel in my body. So a lot of what I've learned is very exploratory in my own self, and then I can convey that to others, which I think lands really well. It's not just these rote memorized cues. It's felt experience and wisdom from the inside that I'm pouring out to people.
Do you think with that misconceptions about pain and healing that are commonplace, but maybe you've learned that need to be redefined?
Yes, pain does not necessarily equate to tissue injury, which is a common belief, right? You can take 100 people in a room and scan all of their spines. 70 of them are probably going to have some sort of degeneration or herniation or disc bulge, but maybe 3 of those people feel pain. And the opposite is also true. You can have someone with a lot of chronic pain in their back and scan them and it be completely fine and leave people, a little puzzled. So pain can be tricky in that way, but pain is more like it comes from the brain. It is the brain saying, I like to say it this way. The pain is like a fire alarm. It doesn't necessarily detect fire, but it will detect smoke, right? Something is going on. It's the pain, it's the body saying, hey, we either have a weakness or something is overstressed and this needs to be looked at. Pain can be tricky. So someone comes to me with knee pain, for example. I'm not necessarily even going to look at the knee. I'll look at it, obviously, and see what's going on, but the body is so intimately connected that I have to look up and down the chain as well. We're taught that we have like around 650 muscles in the body, but I think it's more accurate to say that we have one muscle wrapped and twisted into different fascial bags. Imagine like a long water balloon that you fill up and you can twist it, because everything, the muscles, the connective tissues, the bones, they all are on this one, continuum. Nothing is really individuated in the body. And so when I address somebody, I'm going to look up and down the chain, but I'll also have to look at their gut health, their stress levels, their mindset and mental state, their emotions, because there's something called central sensitization where when the brain has a lot of incoming stressors, let's say we have a poor diet, which can be driven from emotional pain. Let's say we got a divorce. Now, everything that you did was healthy is just going in the tank because you don't have the energy to keep that up, or you just want comfort food. And then we have back pain on top of that, and maybe there's more alcohol consumption. All of these incoming stressors are going to heighten the sensitization of the nervous system and increase our ability to perceive pain, which is really interesting, because sometimes there's nothing actually wrong and they just need to find a way to relax more.
You're saying there's stressors within the person's life, whether it be a divorce or something like that that causes a mental pain, and that almost exacerbates the physical pain.
Absolutely. And with central sensitization, when your nervous system is very, very in that heightened sensitive state, it'll turn off the smaller muscles that create stability around our joints. So that's something really important to remember, because we have to turn those back on. They don't automatically just turn back on when the stressor goes away. So a lot of times, you can experience a big trauma, some big pain event, like emotionally, and then 2 years later, you start to see the effects of that. It may not be right away, whether that be digestive issues or immune system issues or even back pain. And I always ask my clients, like, what are the 5 greatest stressors in your life, and have you dealt with them? Because that's going to tell me kind of where the pain's, is it a perceived pain, or is it just an overstress and the brain's on high alert? And that's something really important that is overlooked by a lot of practitioners.
Huh. So would you call that maybe someone being in more of a fight or flight mode and being less aware of the pain in their body and manifesting later on as a more intensified pain? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. And the body kind of, when we're in fight or flight, it suppresses everything because we have to survive in that situation. So, yeah, very much so.
Another question that I have, that a lot of people believe that aging is inevitable and pain comes along with aging, right? Um,
This is this is my favorite question. We are not designed to degrade with age. We're not. I've personally seen, but you can also see it all over the internet, 80 and 90-year-olds moving some better than I do. That's proof that it's possible, one, and they're not just some outlier. All of us are designed to be this way. Pain doesn't come with with age, it comes with a lack of movement. And if we look at our modern lifestyles, they're just very, very unnatural. They don't require the same movement as our ancestors did. Our ancestors, they ran on a regular basis, they climbed trees, they hunted, they threw spears, they gathered by the fire and sat in deep squats for resting positions. We don't do any of those things now. We literally have a box that we can tap a few buttons on and have food brought to us. So the reduction of movement is more along the lines of why we experience more pain than aging itself. When I take people from, let's say I take them into a mobility class, I'm looking at how many degrees of freedom they have at each joint. And sometimes we talk about optimal posture, and optimal posture is beneficial not because it's better to be upright, but because in that position, I'll show you from this way, we have a better opportunity to move that shoulder in its fullest range of motion versus being in this posture. All of a sudden, I try to externally rotate and it's just not possible. And the brain works on like conserving energy. So it's always going to do its best to conserve energy to the best of its ability. So that whole notion of like, we don't use it, we lose it. It's very true in the human body. The brain will actually downregulate mechanoreceptors of the back of the joint capsule. So it won't send the muscle there. So it won't send the signal there to fire that muscle. That's why we start to lose range. And then as we start to collapse in our posture, these muscles are too weak to pull that shoulder back into the optimal instantaneous axis of rotation, which just means like the head of the humerus sitting in the socket in the center. And when that happens, it creates, wear and tear on the ligaments and the joint capsule. And that's just the shoulder, for example, but that goes with every other joint in the body. So mobility training I always tell people when they come to my classes, first, this is brain training. I have to help people put certain positions back on their brain map that the brain has lost access to. And when we do that, we have more degrees of freedom. So there's something called the dynamic systems theory. And this is really important for people to understand because the body is not going to choose the same path every time. We don't have like a squat motor program. If a kid jumps out of a tree, he's not going to think, okay, how am I going to land best? His brain is going to organize the movement on the path of least resistance. And so if we have all of the degrees of freedom in our joints, if our fascia is still gliding and pliable, the brain's just going to pick the fastest way to get there every time, but every time it should look differently. This is what prevents wear and tear. When we start to limit, right, we start to limit our degrees of freedom, now the brain has maybe 50% of its options to choose from. And so it's going to run the same lines of tension over and over and over. And that's where wear and tear comes in. And that's where pain, originates and develops eventually.
So injury comes from these repetitive mechanical movements over and over and over instead of allowing for freedom of movement. The example that I think of is maybe a weightlifting guy doing the squat position over and over and over, not getting full range of mobility in their knees, and then have guards on their knees because their knees start to hurt.
Yeah. And that actually, you'll see that. And then I can almost guarantee, I'm not going to say this is 100%, but 9 out of 10, if I assess the hip joint of those people needing to wear knee braces, they're going to be lacking a lot of hip internal rotation. Once you get past 90 degrees in a squat, that femur has to internally rotate in the hip socket. And if that doesn't happen, all the force goes into the knee. Well, there's something called the joint by joint approach in the body. The arch should be stiff, the ankle should be mobile, the knee should have stiffness, the hip should be mobile, and it goes on and on and on up the chain. So if we have a mobile joint that is no longer mobile and it's stiff, then all of the force goes into the next joint down, which should be the stiffer joint, right? And so we start to get this wear and tear, and the knee is not meant to absorb that much force. It's because the hips aren't doing their job.
So maybe they have knee injury in that case, but really they need more hip mobility and potentially more ankle flexibility.
Absolutely. You got it.
You're bringing a lot to my attention too that I've never thought about before. And you mentioned before this is brain training, but not just body training. It has to do with the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I take somebody in a class, for example, I'll use the thoracic spine because this is very, very common to be a blind spot on people. A lot of people think of good posture as shoulders back and down, right? That's a thing that we've been taught, shoulders back and down. But if I have this kyphotic posture and I'm very, very rounded, but I pull my shoulders back and down, that does nothing to change the position of my spine. So one of the things that I do is try to wake up that thoracic spine for people. Well, because one, it's on the back of the body and our eyes don't see it. It's hard to access. But two, because everything we do puts us in this posture, it becomes very hard to access. So what I tell people when I put them in certain positions to try to find the sensation is that the first thing we look for is sensation. We cannot train and strengthen what we can't feel. So I'll tell them, and this is quite literal, think about this feeling, and I will tap them on that certain spot that they need to feel. I want you to put your mind here and just imagine a sensation. And as they listen to my cues and start to imagine sensation there, they'll tell me. Everyone does this. I think I feel it. And I'm like, yes, that's it right there. Keep that awareness, keep thinking. And then as you start to increase the sensation, now we can start strength training that area. And strength training isn't like the typical, strength training in a gym at first. It's with a mobility lens. But as they start to get that part of their body back on the brain map, then they have instant access to it. Now they can use it in the squat. Whereas before, and this is cool too, like if I have somebody loaded with a barbell in a squat pattern and I need them to move into more extension, they are not going to be able to find it because they have all of this load and they're trying to find balance on their feet. So I literally start them on the floor, face down with their hands here, almost like that ties into infant development, but I won't go there. That'll be a whole nother conversation. But I have to start them on like a baby level movement for the brain to recognize a new spot on the body. And then we can start advancing it. And then I can have them find it in a squat or a lunge or whatever that is.
So you're starting out again at these most basic movements, going back to infantile development, and bringing about awareness to areas of sensitivity that maybe we've become accustomed to over the course of our very mechanical lives. You said we sit all the time. We don't go into these squat positions anymore like our ancestors used to. So, what are some other ways maybe that people can incorporate these things into their everyday lives, into their homes? Is it sitting in the squat position more often? Is it hanging from a pull-up bar? What are some of those things?
So it's kind of hard for me to give like blanket advice in this arena because I take a very individualized approach. I have a smaller studio space now, and I like smaller classes because I get to know each client and what they need. But I guess the best thing I could say is, so here's some of the homework assignments I give my people. Not all of us have an hour on the mat every day. So I try to weave these, modern or these primitive movements or sensations into modern day. So let's say I'm driving in my car. If you were to drive in your car and you tuck your tailbone just the littlest bit, pressing your lower back into that lumbar support, and then you lightly pull at the steering wheel and you pull your sternum at this 45-degree angle, like toward that windshield, that's going to help you feel the spinal erectors start to engage deep in the spine. And if you're sitting in a chair and you can squeeze your knees together and then rotate both feet apart, that's going to be really good for hip internal rotation. And I'll say, just blanket statement, this is not true for everyone, but those are probably the two most needed movement patterns that people are lacking: thoracic extension and hip internal rotation. And if you just do those two things, I mean, you're saving yourself from hip replacements, because whenever you lose internal rotation of the hip, I can almost guarantee that you'll have a hip replacement at some point in your life, and that's completely avoidable. The same thing, we don't want this kyphotic curve. I have a friend who's got a grandmother right now who's very, very kyphotic, and toward the end stages of life, and she's in a lot of pain, and it's just kind of sad to know that that's all avoidable, and we can just throw these things into our modern day life and not really have to change much about the way we're living.
It really does take a major lifestyle shift, though. In some respect, we do have to add these things into our daily practices, as you're saying. And some people don't have that hour on the mat, like you're saying. But are there small ways, even just again sitting on the ground or something like that? Okay.
I kind of fought my husband to not have a sofa in the house. And it was really nice for a while, but then we had people over for Christmas. It was like our turn. And he's like, well, what about the people who can't sit on the floor? And I'm like, so we got a sofa.
That's
Yeah. But I'll always choose the floor over a chair. Anytime you see me, I'm usually on the floor versus a chair.
I notice that's where you're at right now as well. And you got the weights in the back. You're on the floor, and I've noticed my posture even increase since I do that as well. I think it comes from the yogic background, but I notice if I sleep low to the ground, my back feels better. If I sit on the ground, my legs feel better. I can actually get up from the ground in all these different ways. My muscles feel stronger from that position.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
too often. But again, we're in our cars all the time sitting. We're at computers and chairs sitting. We sit everywhere we go.
Yeah, we never pass 90 degrees. And remember what I said, past 90 degrees is where we get that internal rotation. So that's why we lose it. I mean, there are other reasons why we lose it, but I honestly think that that's probably it's probably the primary reason.
Yeah. What do you think about this? Offshoot question, but what do you think about modern mattresses and the way people sleep?
Oh, man. A Tempur-Pedic mattress that has the ability to change shape and all of that can serve some people in pain. And there's always, kind of like that place where it's, yeah, that person might need it. But if they had never used it, they probably would never need it. I think elevating our head all night, especially, the higher it is, the worse it is. It slows the flushing of cerebral spinal fluid through that happens between like 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. That's some of the most important brain regeneration hours. And I think that a lot of times when I get people with pain, let's just talk like disc pain, disc herniation, sciatica, that kind of stuff, it's because their lumbar is not supported. They're either sleeping in a super hard mattress where their spine is now having to cave under the pressure, or they've got a super cushy mattress. Everybody kind of needs a different level of support, and I think that goes along with your makeup, how much adipose tissue you have, how bony you are, how all of those things factor in. But I think that, like you said, the closer we are to the ground and the more natural the mattress is without all this extra stuff, I think the body maintains its form a lot better.
And for me also, that kind of goes into a conversation of posture and maybe how we hold ourselves on a regular basis. You mentioned rotating the hips and bringing the sternum out and stuff like that. And I also think about the studies of the Superman, Superwoman pose of, standing straight up. They're being more dopamine or serotonin flow going through the system, right? So, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's really interesting how our physical expression of self very often mirrors that internal experience. I don't think that's always true, because you hear those stories of people who commit suicide, but everyone's like, I don't understand, they seem so happy. So I think if we're conscious, we can override that. But generally, emotions are fluid. There's like this fluid change when the neuropeptides pass through the synapses. It creates a different tone in our body. So fluids are going to create a certain tone. If you're in a deep meditative state and you've found a state of peace, the tone of your voice is going to change when you come out of that, and so is the tone of your muscles. And that's going to be totally different than if you just down 2 cold brews and you got to get on stage to talk, right? There's going to be a very different change in tone. And I think that it's very evident to see, one of the most mind-blowing experiences I've had with this particular subject is I went to a Czech course, and my instructor, Ashley, she looked at me up and down. She was doing this to everybody, and she could read these things about me. And I'm pretty good at being like, yeah, I'm fine, and I have good posture, and I have all of the, it's not like anything is blaringly obvious. I can hold, I can save face pretty well. But she read everything that I had been experiencing. It was so mind-blowing to me. So I think that there's definitely something to the way that our internal experience is mirrored in our posture. And I think this is almost a survival mechanism that we developed because we had to store trauma somewhere evolutionarily in order to get through some traumatic experience and survive on the other side. It's like our brain's way of saying, okay, we're going to save that and deal with that later. But now in this modern world, we're so fast paced. We've got 8,000 to-dos and, no time to really self-reflect or have this introspective practice that our ancestors may have had when they were looking up at the stars or sitting around and like talking to people by the fire. And so just like in the muscles, whenever we have an injury, it can create a short-term necessary survival tool, saving trauma in the body, doing a short-term muscle compensation. But in the long term, it's going to create more negative effect, because whenever, let's say we have a broken heart, we tend to like cave. We want to protect ourselves. If this happens long term and we never unwind that trauma or look at it at all, then it's going to stop the flow of energy in the body. We're going to have less access to the tissues of the back, or we're going to have more spots of stagnation that eventually develop inflammation, and fluid and energy don't flow really well there. And I mean, essentially, like everything in the universe is energy and information, and energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed. So like every thought it begins as an energy and it's transformed into some form in the body, whatever that is, whether that's the power pose of feeling expansive. I mean, think of the times that you felt happy and joyful. You've had this positive experience. You're expansive and you're light and this energy's flowing. You might hit this creative state and you're like, oh my God, I've got all these great ideas. But the opposite is true when we're in a negative environment, or like a whatever it is, whether it's fear or depression, or we close down, and this contracted state, this it's like a desire to return back to that fetal position. And it's just to protect ourselves, but it also blocks energy and creativity and ideas. And I believe this kind of ties into my check training. It blocks our ability to tap into our passion and our purpose and our dream. I believe that everyone is gifted with a gift to deliver to the world. We all have something that we're passionate about that lights us up. I found mine, which is amazing, but I can take all kinds of people with pain and health issues, and they have no idea what they want to do in the world because all they hear is pain, but also their posture is limiting their ability for energy and information to flow.
And these are really, really beautiful messages, and you very elegantly cross over mind, body, and how this all runs neurochemically as well. And what pops in my mind when you're saying all of this is when I worked in the cancer departments in the hospital, and the people that I saw in there, it, when I listened to them, they started explaining to me their stories, and it seemed like a weight came off their shoulders as they explained things. And it started getting me thinking, okay, is it start in the mind? Does it start with the thoughts? Does it start with this kind of fight or flight and then store in the body over time and eventually turn into something like a cancer? And I could never definitively say that, but you saying all these things, it makes sense to me that it could develop into something like that.
What's really interesting, Max, is that our emotional system is not different than the immune system. The same apparatus that governs emotions and immune function or hormonal balance, they're not separate. If you think of what emotions do, right? Healthy anger is going to set a boundary and make sure dangerous things or dangerous people don't come into your sphere. Well, what does the immune system do? It stops things that are dangerous from coming in. Emotions are going to let in the things that are safe and welcoming and nurturing, just like the immune system lets in the things that are safe and nurturing, like supplements and vitamins. And what do emotions do? They block things that are harmful, and the immune system is supposed to do the same. So when we hold in our emotions, when we bite our tongue and we don't say what's on our mind, or it also suppresses the immune system. There was a study done in Massachusetts where they took 2,000 women and they followed them for 10 years. Those who were in unhappy marriages but were not allowed to express their emotions were 4 times more likely to die than those who were in unhappy marriages and allowed to express how they felt. I mean, that was mind-blowing to me when I first learned that, because it just drives the point home. Everything's connected. You cannot separate your emotional health from your physiological health. And a lot of people who come to see me are mind blown. And then they'll apologize. I'm sorry, I just told you all of this. I'm like, no, that's why you're here. We're here to heal. We're not going to compartmentalize any of this. I have people who come into strength train sometimes, and we end up going through past traumatic experiences. And I'm not a counselor, so I have to be, mindful of that. But even just listening and just loving them is enough to get them into a healing state because they finally feel heard. Women who are, I see this a lot as well. A lot of women who I have that have autoimmune issues are the women who are hardened and taught to hold everything in, suck it up, buttercup. Like, you're too much, you're too emotional, just put it away. And that's really, really sad for me, because women are emotional. We're emotional for a reason, and it's important for us to be able to emote that and express that. And men too. That's something that men have been taught to be tough, suck it up, but it really does negatively affect our actual health.
Would you say maybe creativity, expression are our natural states?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that if you look at our ancestors' to-do list, it was hunt, gather, and build shelters. But once the shelters were built, that was done. We worked hard for 4 hours a day. We definitely put in a lot of work, but then we had 6 to 8 hours to play, to dance, to sing, to gather firewood, to, sit around the fire, like I said earlier, and to look up at the stars. And we don't have that anymore. And when I'm really busy, and I have to be mindful of this, but when I'm really busy, I don't have that creative flow, and it's harder to tap into that intuitive, like, oh, aha moment, or those genius ideas that just, come from, the heavens. So absolutely, I do think that is our natural state. We just don't live in a natural environment anymore for the human.
That's kind of why I wanted to take the conversation next. It seems like our environment isn't conducive to wellness almost. What's going on there?
You know, we evolved under the sun and the moon and the stars. We evolved to like sit under a shade tree and to like hunker down in a hurricane. And yeah, it's uncomfortable. Can you imagine anyone this day and age just living outside? I mean, I did. I hiked the Appalachian Trail, and that's kind of cool that pulls into this conversation, because hiking the Appalachian Trail took me from literal like antidepressants. I threw them away. I had to wean off of them, and for the first time in my life, had suicidal thoughts. That was wild to me, and I knew it was happening because I knew it was possible, but I never saw myself in that place. But I went from that place to very quickly going and hiking the Appalachian Trail, and I had never experienced more pure joy. Just like this, you go to a concert and you experience this like exacerbated excitement. I don't know if you can call that joy though. I think that's in a rush. I think that's a rush of adrenaline, just like a CrossFit class. It feels good, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but that pure state of joy where like there's just this contentment, and I felt that outside. It was not always comfortable, but because we've become so smart, we have designed these comfortable places to land, and these chairs that are more comfortable than the floor. And I think honestly that is almost to our demise, because we are no longer in touch with the human species needs like we should be. And people don't go outside and play in the rain, and they don't go sit in the sun. I had a guy I was telling him like some of the classes I want to do, or I want them to be outside. And he's like, yeah, but it's so hot in South Louisiana. I'm like, yeah. And he's like, and like, what about when it's cold? I'm like, yeah. And like, that's part of it, getting people back to nature. Because when you do those uncomfortable things, one, you are far more likely to enjoy the beautiful days. Whereas right now, we go in like, oh, it's too hot, turn down the AC. Oh, it's too cold, turn up the heater. We stay at this level of comfort. Now we're, griping about everything. We don't truly appreciate those positive, uplifting, perfect moments, because we try to find that all the time, and we expect to find that all the time. But I really think that there's got to be a way. I haven't found, I mean, I do the best that I can to find it, but it does feel like a constant battle to find how can we maintain a more natural lifestyle in this very unnatural world. I wish I had the answer.
Overall, it sounds like you're saying that we need to be resilient, and maybe the environments that we've created for ourselves allows us to be comfortable. And we have soft, cushy chairs and comfortable beds, but we grew up in environments that allowed us to grow because of the stress that we faced. We need to put ourselves under a little bit of stress sometimes, and that's grow. That's how our minds grow. We have to think and instruct and learn to do things on our own. And without all of that, we atrophy. And there's one main style of therapy that I think of as well that has to do with getting people back in rhythms in nature as well too, right? So waking up with the sun, getting into regular habits, wake up with the sun, go to sleep with the sun at regular times, and that inherently is regulating for our moods, for our hormones, and you know that inherently.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Eating with the sun as well. One interesting thing is that like blue light is going to spike your blood sugar. So if we're always eating under fluorescent lights or with a phone by our face, it's going to be much harder to regulate our blood sugar, which is one of the primary causes of anxiety and binge eating. I've fought with binge eating for a long time, years, Max, years. And I did everything. I did all the emotional work. I did all the deep dive. Like, what is it? Is it because my grandma died and she had eating problems? I mean, I dove down every hole known to man, but it wasn't until I tapped into the blood sugar regulation piece, like learning more about actual human physiology. I haven't binged in probably 3 years because I now manage my blood sugar. And just being under artificial lighting and those blue lights all the time creates these blood sugar spikes and drops and increases cortisol. And, lighting is another huge piece of the, getting back to nature puzzle. And it's hard because these artificial lights are everywhere.
They are, and that's why people say get sunlight in your eyes first thing in the morning, spike the dopamine level or serotonin level, whatever it is. Okay.
And to slowly raise our cortisol. Sorry, say that again.
Then at nighttime, only have red light around that red light spectrum.
Yep, that's exactly right. It's all about the circadian rhythm and the cortisol rhythm, because when our cortisol is really high, like if we wake up in the morning, which I used to do, I used to wake up very, very early, turn all the bright lights on, and that's a steep spike in cortisol. Not to mention if you put your phone in front of your face, and that just goes through the roof. But if you have this very steep spike, it's going to take a lot longer for it to decline. Whereas we should have a very slow incline, like the morning sun. It starts to peak and then it slowly raises. Like our cortisol rhythm should do the same. And then if that happens, then it can slowly start to taper in enough time for melatonin to start to be produced so that we have a good night's sleep. A lot of people want to take melatonin supplements, but my first thing is, okay, let's look at light. Let's look at light as a nutrient, and let's look at how wise or unwise we're using light. And when I tweak that, plus the blood sugar piece for people, their sleep gets a lot better very quickly.
And if we're talking about optimal lifestyles for all of this, it seems like an optimal lifestyle would be to give more space for everything. Ourselves to, okay, work for short blocks of time and then rest, similar to what our ancestors were doing. And maybe replicate situations like a natural environment, actually be out in the light. And as the sun goes, don't blast all these fluorescent lights. Actually turn the lights down at nighttime.
Yeah, get some red light bulbs, get some lamps. I tell people often to eat their lunch in the sun as often as possible, especially if they're eating carbs, which I don't recommend, like avoiding carbs altogether. You might get smart about carb timing, but if you're going to eat a carb, I always suggest being in the sun because it readily, that glucose absorbs so much easier than under, blue lights or any artificial lighting.
How does breath regulate us?
Breath is the most powerful tool that we own, and it is the missing pillar in health. I worked with a lot of people over the last 8 years, a lot of people, and I'll say maybe 2, maybe 3 have actually had optimal breath mechanics, which is mind blowing. I mean, it's really mind blowing. No one breathes well anymore. And the reason this is so important is because the first 2/3 of your lungs are primarily innervated by the sympathetic nervous system, whereas that bottom third of the lungs they're primarily innervated by the parasympathetic nervous system. So if you're never taking deep breaths, if you're living here, you're always stimulating that fight or flight response. Now, we can take breath and we can look at it. It is a direct mirror to what the mental emotional state is, but it's also the tool to change it. Whenever I take someone in and I start assessing breath, I'm going to first look at how many breaths they're taking in a minute. Most people, it's an average of 12 to 16, whereas a healthy human, it should be about 6 to 8 breaths a minute. You can also take their pulse rate and divide it by their breath rate. And you can determine by that number, if it's a whole number, it shows that their brain and heart are in coherence. And if it's an uneven number, like a 4.35, for example, then they're very coherent. And so it's almost like stepping on the gas and the brake at the same time. They're doing this all day long. I will say everyone that I've worked with that experiences anxiety cannot breathe, and they don't know how to fully use their diaphragm. We take about 25,900 breaths in a day. We have that many opportunities to positively or negatively affect our mind and our mental and emotional state, which is really powerful if you think about it. So one of the most powerful tools for the breath, or breath tools I can give someone, is the physiological sigh. So if you take an inhale, you take an extra sip at the top, and then you audibly exhale, and you've got to hear it. Like, imagine this, and because some people are like scared to make the sound, but if you're rushing through traffic, you're holding your breath, you're late for this appointment, you're definitely not exhaling fully. But let's say we just rushed to the Airbnb, we got to our dream vacation spot, we throw our stuff down, what do? That's like a natural tendency to sigh when we're in a safe place. So for the brain to hear that sigh, it signals, oh, there is no threat around. We have nothing to worry about. We're safe now. That'll drop you into the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest or digest and healing state. This is really cool. It's a cool story. So I was very upregulated for a very long time. I am really, remember I had told you, like, I can save face really well and like I'm fine and seem very happy. Well, I had even hidden the amount of stress that I had from myself, but I was doing way too much, training way too often, training way too intensely. And when I finally came to that realization, I was also drinking two Yeti cups of coffee a day, mind you. Like in the morning, I wouldn't drink it in the afternoon, but I'm like, it's fine. I need this much to feel some sort of stimulus. So when I realized how upregulated I was, I quit coffee completely, and I yawned for about 3 months. I wondered if that would ever go away, but I quit completely for about 9 months' time. Well, this was a really dumb thing, but we learn a lot from the dumb things we do. I had to teach a manifestation workshop. And I was like, you know what? Like, I want some coffee. I need a little bit of brain juice. And I drank this cup of coffee, and I'm driving there and I'm like, oh my God, this is the stupidest decision ever. I used that physiological sigh, and within 5 breaths, the jitters went away. And in that moment, I mean, it's hard to combat the stimulus of caffeine. So in that moment, I realized how powerful that breath was. And it is something that I try to do before every time I eat a meal, because we want to be able to digest. If we're stressing, if we're barely breathing and we go to consume a meal, I don't care how healthy, I don't care how much money you spent on that healthy food in your plate. If you can put it in your mouth, but if you can't digest and assimilate it, it's kind of a waste. So before every meal, I try to get people to do at least 3 to 5 of those breaths. Deep inhale, extra sip at the top, audible exhale, and that puts them in a state for digestion. The breath is probably the most overlooked thing, that tool that we have.
It seems like it's the connection between the mind and the body. It's something that we semi have control over. Usually we're unconscious of it, but we can our brain to be increasingly conscious of it to regulate ourselves over time.
Absolutely. And this ties into pain too, because when you have I'll use back pain, and it kind of goes for a lot of different pains in the body, but back pain primarily because the diaphragm connects to that lumbar spine. So if you're never taking a deep breath, we're never creating space through those vertebrae. So the first thing I do with every client is work on the breath, but especially if they've got back pain. I mean, we're nailing that every time they come into my office. I'm checking, can you really expand? I don't know, do we have enough time where I can kind of go a little bit deeper into this?
Yeah, absolutely.
So a lot of people talk about deep breaths. And when I say take a deep breath, it's very nasally and rushed and in the chest, even if it's just in the belly and you see this big belly expansion like they teach in yoga. That is an emergency breath, not necessarily the belly breath, but that you'll hear it a lot in yoga classes. So I tell people, don't focus on the depth of the breath first. What happens if a tiger pops up from around the corner? You're going to say, and you're going to run as fast as you can, right? So we don't necessarily want to pull hard nasal breath up through the nose because that stimulates the chest and the neck and the shoulders. I always cue people to breathe first before they focus on depth. think about the pace. How slow can you breathe? Can you breathe so slow that you would imagine the hairs in your nose don't even move on the inhale? And then on the exhale, can you soften everything as you very slowly, almost effortlessly, let all the air seep out? And when I can take people into that state, when they can finally find that state, it takes some time. So you won't be able to just slow it down immediately. But over the course of a minute, 2 minutes, you're going to notice it's easier and easier to get a deep breath. What I'm really trying to do is get people to first be, what's the word I'm looking for? Be more mindful in how and where they're pulling in air. Because we always think about the front of the body, right? But I also want to create expansion in the back and the sides and even in the upper back. If I had you laying down on the floor, the first thing I'm going to have you feel is, can you breathe down into the pelvis? Because what that's doing is it's pulling the diaphragm all the way down. I can take a deep breath, but if my ribs are flaring and my chest is lifting, the back of the diaphragm is not going to fully descend. So I have them see if they can breathe into the very front of the pelvis. If you take your hands on those hip bones and you move just into that soft tissue right inside the hip bones, you should feel some expansion there. And then can you breathe into the lower back? You'll feel some expansion there. And then into the sides of the ribs. So we want the sideways expansion. The rib should be almost like a bucket handle that open and close this way. And then finally into the upper back. And when I can get people to do that, that's telling me that they're using their diaphragm in the fullest range of motion. And then we can start to optimize our breathing in all kinds of other ways. But no one ever looks at how and where we're breathing in the body. They always think about deep breath. And so that's something I definitely want to teach and share with as many people as possible.
Thank you for sharing that. And I noticed walking me through that it's difficult to breathe into that pelvis area. I even
Yes.
noticed stomach gurgling stuff going on, and maybe it's because I very seldom breathe there unless I'm in meditation.
That's right. And whenever we're breathing and we're breathing in that full diaphragmatic way, we're pumping our organs. So digestion's going to get better, without adequate breath. So I have the totem pole here, the Czech totem pole. And at the very top of the totem pole, I don't know if you can see it there. It's kind of a glare for me. Can you see that bird at the top?
Yes.
Okay, so
Wait,
that's the psyche. The psyche is your soul. Your mental state is going to change how you're breathing. It's going to change your posture, which affects your digestion. And the very next rung is the breath. The breath is at the very top of the totem pole when it comes to what the brain prioritizes in the body. If you're not breathing adequately and slowly, at least sometimes, you're not going to heal your gut. You're not going to improve your sleep. You're not going to lose the weight. You're not going to balance your hormones. And all of that can start to create more stress and like, what's wrong with me? I'm doing the best that I can. I kind of, when I first started on my health journey, I stressed about doing everything right. Everything just right. I had to, I read every ingredient label. I had a little baby inside growing and then a baby outside. I'm like, oh my God, I'm bombarded with learning everything all at once. And then, I don't know, 8 years later, I learned that if you're stressed, you can't heal. Like, talk about counterproductive. So when, I am a health coach, but I'm like, listen, I will teach you everything you need to know, but do not strive for perfection. Because the first thing you have to focus on is, can you breathe and can you reduce stress? And then do the best you can with what you can after that.
and you mentioned that the mind is at the top. The top of that totem pole was psyche or mental.
That's
Are
exactly right.
that you would uh, give people for the mental side of their lives?
Okay, so if someone is stuck and they can't really, if they've been to therapists and they've done all the things and they come to me and they're like, I don't know what to do anymore. The first thing I give them is an awareness exercise, and it's to create a light and a heavy list. I'm like, listen, put this on the notes in your phone, make this super easy. Do not, write it on paper because you're not going to carry it everywhere. And I really need you to be mindful. So I have them start to take an account of everything that's coming into all of their senses, what they're listening to, what they're watching on TV, the types of conversations, who they're surrounding themselves with what they do for work. I mean, it can go literally, I want it to go on and on and on. I want them to be very specific. And I'm like, you don't have to write a whole paragraph. Netflix binging, that goes on my heavy list. So it's the light versus heavy. what is light making and what is heavy making in your life. And that means here on a soul level, on a heart level. Now, everyone's like, okay, like food. Well, cake would be heavy. Not necessarily. So let's say we've been eating a very clean diet for 3 weeks and you go to your little nephew's birthday. And at this birthday party, he's like, will you share some cake with me? And, in that moment, if you were to turn down that cake, you're separating yourself from your tribe. You're taking some joy from this little boy that wants to share something with you. That might actually feel pretty heavy because you've been doing so well. So the cake itself is not heavy or light. Now let's flip that example. So let's say I've been eating like crap for 3 weeks and I'm really not listening to my body and I'm making all these poor choices. And I really decide like, okay, today's the day, but I have little Timmy's birthday party and he offers me cake. It might actually feel lighter for me to say, hey buddy, I would love to share that cake with you. Can I just have one bite of yours? And then not take your own cake. That will feel lighter. So it's all circumstantial. You have to pay attention to the internal response to the stimulus that's coming in. And so after they make that list, one is usually really short. That's the light list, One is usually really long, and that's the heavy list. Well, it takes a lot of energy to create change in our life, right? If we're so bombarded by so many heavy things in our life, we are not going to have the energy to initiate or create change. And so what I start doing is I start knocking off the easiest things on the heavy list. I'm like, listen, what are the easiest things for you to give up? I'm not going to ask you to give up gluten and alcohol right away because you don't have the energy to do that. So let's take off like Netflix binging. That's really not that complicated. And so they start removing the things on their heavy list that are easy. And then we have to do the work of, okay, what makes you feel light? I've had some people come in and have nothing on that light list, so now I have to do the work of, okay, let's go back to childhood. Let me introduce you to some practices, those kinds of things. And then once we get that nailed down, then we can start to create more lightness in their life. I've had a lady who was suffering from very chronic illness, and I'm not her last stop, right? I should always be everyone's first stop. I'm going to teach you the foundations, but I may not be your last. But when she came back in here after I gave her that exercise, 1 week later, she was so mad. And I was like, why are you angry? Like I felt like I had done something wrong. And she's like, it's so effing simple. Like I feel better already just having an awareness of what my environment is and taking off the things that are really dragging me down. And she was just so angry. No one had ever taught her to be mindful of her environment anymore. So, aside from like the first light in the morning, managing blood sugar, that awareness exercise is really, really powerful. And it's changed. I've had many people say this has changed my entire life. And I think it's not the exercise. I think it's the awareness that we create.
You're talking about stock of the consumption, not just our food consumption, but what's affecting us on all levels, the people that we hang out with, the videos that we watch, the shows that we watch, and the environments, and all little levels. And maybe we become so complacent with it, it becomes normal with us because we're there around it every day. But we don't have some of it is really heavy to us. To slowly cut those, incorporate things that are lighter, and slowly shed the things that are heavy. That's what makes the mental difference.
Exactly right. And a lot of times people don't realize that their phone call with their mom is like the thing that's weighing them down. She might love to harp on, Aunt Joe's drama. And you're like halfway listening, cooking dinner, and you feel obligated to do this. But when you start to make this light and heavy list, I'm not saying always ignore your mom's phone call. But if you're not in a good place, maybe don't answer it and maybe call her back once you've done something that makes you feel lighter so you can actually hold more space and it won't just like, put you in the dirt by the time you hang up with her. It's kind of tricky for some of these things. Some of these heavy things we can't remove. But if we can fill that light list, then we can manage the heavy stuff that we can't change.
I see. Incorporate more lightness and spaciousness so we can take on the heavier weights that we face. Yeah. And Jade Hayes, is there final messages that you would like to give for anybody watching?
I want everyone to know that we have thousands and thousands and thousands of years of evolutionary wisdom entangled in our DNA. And if we can listen and honor that, the mind is very, very loud if we have not addressed it. The soul is very quiet. It whispers. I tell this to people all the time, so we have to be paying attention. But it's this internal wisdom that we typically ignore because we've become conditioned from the outside world. If we can just drop our conditioning, and this takes time and it takes practice and lots of practice, right? But if we can start to pay attention to that little whisper, I'll give you a short little story. I have a busy schedule, and at this point in time, I was teaching a mobility class at a CrossFit gym, and I taught the class at 5:30, and they had like a 4:30 very intense fly fit is what it was called. And so instead of going and like sitting for an hour in my car, I would make myself go to this class. Well, as I was driving every week, every Wednesday, I'd be driving to this class and I'd get a headache, slight headache. Sometimes I'd get like flu-like symptoms. I could feel like chills in my body, and I could feel, and
Hmm.
and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. But I had been feeling fine, and so I just ignored it. And I was like, well, if I feel bad in the class, then I'll push through. But what happens with adrenaline and cortisol? It skyrockets, and we can no longer hear those internal cues anymore. And so I did this over and over and over again. I was ignoring this internal wisdom. And eventually I came to my senses, and I realized what was happening because it wouldn't stop every week. I was doing too much. I was too busy, and it was just too much. And we have these little cues, but in my head, and I can still hear that voice, right? Yeah, but you got to work out. Yeah, but you got to lose weight. Yeah, but you got to da da da. All of these things that we hear from the outside world. And if people would just slow down enough to hear this inner wisdom and to honor it, and that's the most important piece, because a lot of people hear it and they don't honor it, then they're going to start to find this path of healing. And the path of healing is not always linear. In fact, oftentimes when we get out of that stress state, we oftentimes feel worse. I've had numerous clients say, yeah, but all of my symptoms are so much worse now. And I'm like, hold on, that's okay. You know how it's like the body has finally settled, and all the symptoms it suppressed, it stops suppressing and it starts speaking to you. And it's very loud and it's very uncomfortable. But that discomfort is giving you signs and symptoms and kind of directing where we should go in life and what choices we should make and what choices we should drop. But you know how a toddler comes home from maybe preschool or kindergarten and he just unloads on his mom because he finally feels safe to do so? That's what our body's doing when we come from like disease and illness and pain and we finally start listening. So I would just want people to know that one, we have this wisdom and that it is the most intelligent piece of advice you'll ever get. It comes from inside. And two, when you start to go on this healing journey, just be patient and honor your body. And it's okay to rest. We need more rest than we need more doing, especially this day and age.
These are really wonderful messages. Like you said, in this day and age where everybody tends to be very rested, very overly active, we need to take that step back, slow down, reflect, and pay attention to that inner wisdom that you're talking about. And thank you very much for talking today. This was a really great conversation. Always good talking with you. And thank you for being here.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. And thanks for listening. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time.